I hope we're not boring you, Jerry. It's the best that I've got. What we're trying to do is certainly, and not in a professional way, is just pull a bunch of videotapes that I do have together and try to show stage performance or platform personality or whatever you might want to call it. The next video, though, is one that we do weekly in a Sunday school class I teach. A class of about 100 people, and they are fairly vocal. There's a lot of activity, and they do a lot of talking. But basically, each Sunday, we record my particular portion of the lesson, and then we use it to distribute to shut-ins or something so that they don't miss anything. I won't try to play the entire lesson for you because I don't expect to try to preach to you. Basically, what I'd like to do is try, though, to present enough that does show a concept. Try to pull some things together such that you're teaching a particular topic or a particular concept. This is about February of this year, and I think we're studying somewhere in the book of John. All right, we'll go to the next video then.
Our resident college president, Dr. John Ellis.
Thank you, John. Good night.
Let's hear about the bull. Some more bull at us.
Tell the story again, John.
Wait a minute. Be serious. There's some things that we've got to cover. You can't just jump into something like that. Next week, Richard will be doing the entire class, and I'm sure you'll get an opportunity to check out some of the things that the two of them got to do over the period of the last several weeks. Richard and Kim have spent right at 14-plus days in Israel, both as a filming expedition and an archaeological dig. So there may be some very interesting things that they'll want to share with you. Yeah, well, we're milking that build-up, you got to admit. This is the last Sunday in one section of the study in John. We're in the 9th chapter of John today. Beginning next week, we start a new unit, yet we stay in John, a new theme. So Richard will set the introduction for the new theme, which will begin in John 10. Let's go backwards, though, and review what went on in this particular section over the period of the last 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. The general topics were focused on God's care for certain types of people. Through Christ, through Jesus, the type of care and concern that God showed. I think the 4 Sundays ago, the lesson had to do with the lonely. That was the woman at the well, and Richard handled that extremely well. Then we moved to a study of anxiety and the hope that God brought to those who had anxiety in their lives. Then last week we talked a little bit about frustration and what care and concern toward frustration meant. I want you to reflect back on those to a time that you were lonely. Think backwards to a point in time that you were lonely, and that something focusing through a spiritual dimension ministered to you. Whether or not it was somebody from a church that called on you and expressed care and concern and love for you, or something entirely different from that. Focus back, though, on attention when you were lonely and something in a spiritual dimension ministered to you. Any one thing come to anybody's mind that they'd care to share? Okay. Nobleman came to Christ and said, you got to come down and help my son who's sick. Extreme amount of anxiety present there because he had to relinquish control. He had to admit that he was incapable of doing what it was necessary to be done. And he had to put everything in somebody else's hand, and it's not fear, because fear is of the real, and yet anxiety is of the possible. We don't know what's coming down the pike, but we still worry about it and fret and possess all sorts of degrees of anxiety. Who can share some amount of anxiety? Come on, Terry. Frustration. Last week we studied the man who had been crippled for 38 years. Yeah, there were some frustrations present on that trip, but can you give me a positive out of it? Everybody could comment on loneliness, anxiety, or frustration. Today, though, we study blindness. How many of you have ever been blind? Hey, Richard raises, hey, there's another hand or two. Okay, that threw me a curve. I really wasn't prepared for that. But let me ask you, those of you who didn't raise your hand, how do you know that you're not blind? Now, you could get into some sort of esoteric discussion about whether or not you know something that you don't know and whether or not it actually occurs one way or the other. You know, the old philosophical question that if a tree fell somewhere in a secluded forest, would noise be present when the tree hit the ground? You say, well, sure it would know. It may not. Unless somebody is there to hear it, noise may not exist. Sound may not exist. But how do you know that you're not blind? Well, you say, well, because I can see. Yeah, but what about those things you're not seeing? You don't know that you're not seeing them. And as a result, you don't know that you're not blind. You may be in a state right now that you are blind, but you've never experienced what's beyond that, and therefore you don't know what it's like to be beyond that. Well, that's ridiculous, I know. And it is. But let me think about it in a different sense. What about spiritual blindness? I go around doing this all the time. Now, am I blind? I don't see. When I do this, I cannot see. And if I cannot see, does that make me blind? Does the refusal to see constitute blindness? Okay, we'll hold that for a minute. Now let's go to spiritual blindness. What determines spiritual blindness? In a sense, I think whether or not you know it, you may be spiritually blind because you haven't looked beyond the dimension that you have experienced, and maybe there's something out there that you should be experiencing beyond that, and if so, then you are not experiencing what you could be experiencing. Still kind of weird. What about those spiritually blind when you refuse to look? Does that constitute blindness? When somebody says there are truths contained in this book that will give you insight, that will give you literally sight, and you refuse to look at it, does that make you blind? That's closing your eyes and saying, I will not see, I will not look. In a sense, it does make you blind. I looked up trying to find a definition for spiritual blindness. If I were going to define it, I would say the most common cause of spiritual blindness is human, that's yours and my, determination to make God conform to my image and do what I want. It's a problem that the Jews faced in Jesus' day. To say, I don't know what's happening down the pike. I'm quite content to see as far as I can see now, and I refuse to look any further than that. And as a result, I am spiritually blind by that definition. What causes spiritual blindness? Obviously, blindness as physical blindness, any number of things can go in. What causes, though, spiritual blindness? Lack of obedience. Okay. Ignorance. Lack of faith. Prejudice. A hard heart. Fear. Fear could easily do it. Let's look at some of the causes that's present in the entire book, 9th chapter, the entire chapter of the book of John, 9th chapter. We studied today about a man who was blind from birth. Now, last week, the guy that had been crippled for 38 years. Here's a fellow who's been blind longer than that. So, well, how do you know? Well, he's been blind all of his life. I get in discussions with the kids, and let me see if I can remember how it goes. I say the kids have known me. No, I have known the kids longer than they have known me. Because I've known them all of their life, and they've only known me a portion of mine. They've only known me a third of my life or something. And they say, no, it's the same. I say, no, it's not. All of your life I've known you, and you've only known me a third of my life. It's got to be different. Isn't the sum of something less than a third of something else? How long this person had been blind, we don't know. But he had been blind all of his life. Let's pick up in the 9th chapter, the book of John, and we'll talk about sight for the blind, both physically blind and spiritually blind. Beginning in verse 1, and we're going to take the entire chapter, verse or two at a time. We'll dignify it as we go, and then we'll skip on from that. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? In that day and time, it was not uncommon for a philosophy to think that tragedy was a correlate with sinfulness. In a sense, that made the well people really smug in their virtue. You reflect on that for a moment. If your tragedy, yes ma'am, come on Chris.
Oh God, I find that is the prevalent.
The opinion or the potentiality for truth? Okay, the opinion is. The potentiality for truth is still prevalent today too, because last week we talked about the fact that sin is insidious enough that guilt can be in my life, and as a result I can both mentally and physically be sick. As a result, it is a correlate in that sense. In this sense, though, the opinion was, and Chris says it's prevalent today, to say, because you are sick, you have sinned. And one of the good things about that is that for those of us who are not sick, we get to be smug about it in our virtue and tell everybody else that they're not as good as we are. That's the point in that sort of philosophy. Because I am well, I have not sinned, and therefore you have, and you're sick, and I'm better than you. And that philosophy was very prevalent in that day. They thought, though, that if a person from birth had a problem, you had to go backwards and say that only two occasions could be present. The parents either sinned, or the individual, in a prenatal sense, somehow sinned. We're bothered by this. The disciples saw this as an unresolved question and a problem. So in verse 2, they said, when they saw this sight and had an example that they could call to attention, they asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? Now, at that point in time, I think they were looking for guidance. They were looking for some sort of direction, but they were also looking beyond that. They were wanting to know who and how so that they could fix blame. You know, if you tell me, Rabbi, that it's this man, then I can blame it on somebody. If you tell me this way, I'll know how it occurred. They're looking for cause and not cure. In a sense, they were looking for blame and not change. And in verses 3, 4, and 5, Jesus immediately said, your question's invalid. Your question is invalid coming out the gate. It doesn't really matter. He says, neither this man nor his parents. It's not a result of him or his parents' sin. It's interesting to note that it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents. That does not imply that they had not sinned. It implies only that this is not a result of any sin in his life or in their life. But he says this is done so that God's will and work can be made manifest at this point in time. All of this has been set up so that God's work can be manifest. Now put yourself in the part of that blind guy. You are an instrument of the Lord. It's a rough road to hoe, isn't it? You mean I've got to be blind all of my life just so God can be made manifest at this one point in time? That wouldn't be a job I'd want to volunteer for. You'd have to start saying, why me? How did I get selected for this? I would much rather, and if you're saying why me, rather than say why me for him, say why not you? Why not you? Because you too are manifest, made, brought to the time and place and position, everything that you are, so that God's work can be made manifest in you. Except you've been blessed. Why? Why you? Why were you born one out of 1,000 people in the world that happened to be born in the United States of America? Happened to be born in a country that gives you everything that is afforded you at this point in time. I'll tell you why. So that God's work can be made manifest in you. That's the reason you were created. That's the reason you were to this point in time. Now, what sort of vessel, what sort of allowance of God's manifestation are you allowing yourself to be? Jesus so immediately did something about it. He didn't look for the cause of this. He looked for a cure. And he looked so the opportunity could be, God's mighty powers could be displayed in him. 4 and 5 are not that critical. 6, though, when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes. Sounds nauseating, doesn't it? Whit, that's gross, isn't it? He spat on the ground, mixed clay with it, or dirt with it, made mud and applied it to the man's eyes. It's not so far out, though, because in that day and time, spittle was considered to have some sort of medicinal purposes and value. And you'd have, in a sense, that same sort of opinion today. You cut your finger, and what do? That hurt. That's something. Lots of times that happens. And in ball-playing situations, you know, you get a strawberry on your elbow or something, they say, I'll spit on it and rub a little dirt and it'll be okay. You know, tough it out, it'll help. But in those days and times, it was deemed a healing virtue to put a little... With that opinion, I think Christ probably did this as a crutch for the man. Now, here's a guy that's been blind from birth. If he had any spirituality in him at all, surely he's at times said, Lord, heal my blindness. And nothing has happened. And as a result, surely his faith is suffering. And as a crutch to his faith, Jesus applies this sort of purpose to him. It gives him a little boost. You know, he said, hey, you know, maybe there is something to this. And as a result, he mixes clay, verse 6. He spits in the ground, applies the clay to his eyes, and so go wash in the pool of Siloam. Siloam, which is translated sin. And he went away and washed and came back seeing. The object of helping his faith, and then the fact that there was a certain belief that spittle could have some medicinal purposes to it, helped God make manifest his work at this point in time. Now there's another kicker to all of this, though. Sabbath day. Remember last week we said medicine was not practiced on the Sabbath? If you had a bandage on your head and it was designed to keep the wound from getting worse, it was okay. But if it was designed to keep it or help it get better, it was a no-no. Spitting and making the salve to apply to his eyes was against the oral tradition of the day. As a result, now we've got this confrontation coming down again. In a sense, though, who cured the man? What cured the man? Was it the spit? The dirt? The washing? The faith? No, it was Jesus. That God's mighty works might be made manifest in this man. And it was. In a sense, the man moved from darkness to light. All of his life, he's been in the dark. Now his eyes are open, and he's in the light. I know that meant something to him, but it's a problem to those people that are still in the darkness. You let somebody from among us be blessed in some way, and those of us who do not get equal blessings have difficulty with it. The man went from darkness to light, but all those that he left in the darkness, and not just physically dark, but spiritually dark also, had difficulty with it. And from this point forward, we pick up a comic opera. From this point forward, in this chapter, we really pick up a comic opera. Let's look in verse 8. He went away, washed, and he came back seeing. The neighbors, therefore, his friends and confidants, and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, isn't this the guy who used to sit around here and beg all the time? And others were saying, this is he. And others were saying, no, no, he's like him. But all the time he kept saying in verse 9, I'm the one. They would say, well, you're not the same guy that used to... No, no, you look a lot like him. He said, it's me. It's me. And they were problemed by it. In verse 10, therefore, they were saying to them, how'd you get your eyes opened? And he said, the man who is called Jesus... It wasn't the clay, it wasn't the spit, it wasn't the washing, it was Jesus. The man who called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And I went and washed and I received my sight. And they said, well, where is he now? And the sad commentary was he had to answer, I don't know. Because Jesus sent him away to wash. And he hadn't been able to find him back. Friends and neighbors, as they were, in verse 13, brought then the Pharisees to him, or brought him who was formerly blind to the Pharisees, because it was on the Sabbath, that the day that Jesus had made the clay and opened his eyes. Now the comic opera continues. In verse 15, the Pharisees say to him who had received his sight, as he said to them, he applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees were saying, this is not from God, Because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. God's not in this at all, because this is a Sabbath, and if he were, he wouldn't honor this sort of work on his day. But others were saying, how can a sinner perform such signs? And there was division among them. Rightfully so. You see the camp starting to be divided. One of them saying, this got to be apart from God, because nobody could work on the Sabbath and honor God. And others say, yeah, but if he's a sinner, how does he do this unless God's in him somehow? So they got problems with both of those. 17, they cast then this division back to the blind man. What do you say about him since he opened your eyes? You're the first-hand experiencer of all of this. Who do you say the man is? And he said, well, he's a prophet. Seemed like a safe enough answer. You watch this blind man's faith grow as he starts and experiences one little success after another. He starts at a point in the continuum and says he's a prophet. Well, the Jews therefore did not believe it of him, because he had been blind and had received sight, until they finally decided to call the parents of the very one who received his sight. I don't like your answer, boy. You're not helping me at all. Therefore, I want to talk with your parents. Bring them in. So they brought them in. And in verse 19, they questioned them, saying, is this your son, who you say was born blind, that does now see? The parents copped out. They answered them and said, well, wait. We know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. You see the comic opera developing? They're just grabbing at straws. They call the parents in, and they say, now look, this is who you say your son is, who you said once was blind. What's the story behind this? They said, well, we know he's our son. We know he was blind. We don't know how he now sees. We don't know who helped heal him. You might as well ask him, though. He's of age. Ask him. Then it gives you a reason for this. Verse 22. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone would confess him to be the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Is that a big deal? It was. Very big deal. It was a big deal because it was not only the focus of worship, but it was the focus of one's livelihood. If you got put out of the synagogue, you had no spiritual relationships with anybody. Not only did you have no spiritual relationships, they didn't do business with you. You're a merchant? Not only, well, say you're not a merchant, they wouldn't employ you. You didn't get a job. You were literally ostracized. Now that made for a lot of strong cooperation. With that sort of club over somebody's head, you could dictate a number of things to them. I got to reflecting back when I started reading that, and I can't think of the exact example, and I'm sure some of you can, though. Who was